Emily Carter drove the last stretch of the highway with both hands steady on the wheel, her windshield wipers working against a thick curtain of snow. Pennsylvania winters were never gentle, but tonight the cold felt sharper, more deliberate, as if the road itself were testing her patience. The dashboard clock glowed softly in the dark. She was running later than planned, but she didn't mind. Every mile closer to home loosened something tight in her chest. For weeks, her life had been reduced to hotel rooms, compliance reports, and long days spent untangling other people's financial messes. Now, all she wanted was warmth. A quiet house, a shower that lasted longer than 5 minutes, and Brady. Just the simple comfort of seeing her husband's face after being apart, of slipping back into a version of life that felt familiar and safe. She imagined the smell of dinner lingering in the kitchen, the hum of the heater, Brady half asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chest. Thanksgiving didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be normal. As she turned onto their street, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always did this time of year. Strings of lights lined porches and railings. Inflatable decorations swayed slightly in the wind. A wreath hung on the front door of the house across the street, its red bow bright even through the snowfall. Everything about the scene suggested warmth, routine, and quiet celebration. Emily slowed the car and pulled into her driveway. The engine ticked softly as she turned it off. For a moment, she just sat there listening. The street was still, peaceful. Then she looked up at her house. It was dark, not dim, not partially lit, but completely dark, the windows reflecting nothing but snow and night. She frowned, checking the time again, then glanced at her phone. No missed calls, no messages. She told herself Brady must have stepped out. Maybe he'd gone to the store. Maybe he'd fallen asleep early and forgotten to turn on the lights. She stepped out of the car, the cold biting immediately through her coat, sharper than she expected. As she crossed the short path to the front door, a small knot of unease tightened in her stomach. It wasn't panic. Not yet. Just a quiet, unwelcome question she couldn't quite name. Emily unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence hit her first. Not the calm quiet of an empty house, but something heavier, thicker, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Then came the cold. It wrapped around her ankles, climbed up her legs, settled into her bones. The house felt unheated, abandoned. "Brady!" she called, her voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. She stood just inside the doorway, her hand still resting on the knob, listening again. The absence of response wasn't dramatic. It didn't shout danger, but it was enough to unsettle her. Emily closed the door behind her, the latch clicking softly. The first alarm had sounded, faint and easy to ignore, but it was there all the same. Emily took another step inside and paused, her breath catching almost immediately. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was wrong. The air felt sharp against her skin, dry and lifeless, the kind of cold that settled deep into walls and furniture after hours of neglect. She could see her breath faintly in the dim light from the hallway. Her eyes went to the thermostat on the wall. The screen was dark. She tapped it once. Nothing. The system was off. Completely off. In late November, with snow falling outside. The temperature inside the house had dropped to a level that wasn't just careless. It was dangerous. A slow chill spread through her chest, and then she smelled it. At first it was faint, buried beneath the stale cold air, but with every step forward it grew stronger. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Emily stopped moving, her body reacting before her mind caught up. She knew that smell. It was one she had encountered before in case files and emergency situations, always tied to neglect and situations that had gone on far too long. Human waste. Her keys slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft clatter as she turned toward the living room. The light there was low, filtered through the blinds by the street lamp outside. The room looked frozen in time. Victor Harmon sat in the old recliner near the window. For a moment, Emily couldn't process what she was seeing. He was curled inward, his shoulders hunched, his body trembling beneath a thin blanket that looked far too small for him. His frame had wasted away to something fragile and sharp. Bones pressing against fabric, skin stretched thin and gray. This was a man who had once stood tall, commanding space without effort. Now, he looked like he was folding in on himself. His lips were cracked and dry. His eyes were half open, but unfocused. His hands shook violently in his lap. And beneath the chair, dark and unmistakable against the hardwood floor, was the source of the smell. Emily moved without thinking. She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold floor biting through her clothes. "Victor," she said softly, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse spiked. "It's Emily. I'm here." His eyes shifted, slowly finding her face. Shame passed over his expression before relief settled in, heavy and humiliating all at once. He tried to speak, but the sound barely made it past his throat. Emily didn't wait. The shock burned hot behind her ribs, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't the moment for it. She pressed her fingers gently to his wrist. His pulse was weak but present. His skin was cold, too cold, yet damp at the same time. Dehydration, hypothermia risk, prolonged exposure. "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "We're fixing this." Her movements were controlled, now deliberate. She pulled the blanket tighter around him, shielding his shaking body as best she could. Her mind began organizing priorities: heat, fluids, hygiene, stability, each step lining up with clinical clarity. The shock was still there, pressing at the edges of her awareness. But urgency had taken over. Someone had left him like this. And Emily understood, with terrifying certainty, that whatever explanation waited for her in this house, it would not be enough. Emily moved carefully away from the recliner, every step measured, as if sudden movement might shatter what little stability remained in the room. Victor's breathing was shallow and uneven. He needed water, heat, care. All of that could wait for a few seconds. She headed toward the kitchen. The air there was just as cold, the tile floor unforgiving beneath her feet. She grabbed a glass from the cabinet, turned on the faucet, and waited. The pipes groaned in protest before a thin stream of water finally appeared. As the glass filled, her eyes drifted to the center island. That was when she saw it. A single sheet of lined notebook paper lay on the counter, placed deliberately, as if it were meant to be found. There was nothing else around it. No groceries, no dishes, just the paper and the quiet. Emily set the glass down slowly and reached for the note. She recognized Brady's handwriting instantly. Loose, careless, the kind of writing that never worried about being neat because it never expected consequences. Her fingers tightened around the page as she read. "Emily, Mom and I went on a cruise. Last-minute deal. We needed a mental health break. Since you're back, you can take care of Victor. He's been moody anyway. Don't wait up. Back Monday." There was a small, smiley face at the bottom. Emily read it again, then a third time. A cruise. Her gaze flicked back toward the living room, toward the shape of a dying man shivering in the dark. The words on the page rearranged themselves in her mind, connecting to the cold, the silence, the thermostat turned off. They hadn't forgotten Victor. They had planned this. Turning off the heat wasn't an oversight. It was a choice, a calculation. Fewer bills while the house sat empty. A dying man left behind to endure the cold because caring for him was inconvenient. Emily lowered herself onto the edge of a kitchen chair, the note still clutched in her hand. Her chest felt hollow, as if something essential had been quietly removed without her noticing. This wasn't panic. It wasn't rage. It was understanding. Brady hadn't asked her to help. He had assigned responsibility the way one assigned a chore. Elaine hadn't hesitated. They had boarded a ship, ordered drinks, and left a terminally ill man alone in a freezing house, assuming Emily would arrive in time to clean up the consequences. They had counted on her reliability. They had counted on her silence. Emily folded the note once, carefully, and set it back on the counter. Her hands were steady now. Too steady. The warmth she had imagined on the drive home, comfort, familiarity, trust, evaporated completely, leaving behind something cold and clean-edged. The woman who had driven through the snow expecting a marriage to come home to no longer existed. What remained stood up, picked up the glass of water, and turned back toward the living room without another glance at the note. There was work to do. Emily set the glass of water down beside the recliner and turned back toward the hallway. The house needed heat before anything else. She adjusted the thermostat, raising it carefully, listening as the system hesitated and then responded with a low, strained hum from somewhere deep within the walls. Warm air would take time, but at least it was coming. She returned to Victor and crouched beside him again. "We're going to get you cleaned up," she said quietly, keeping her voice even and calm. "You're safe. I've got you." Victor's eyes flickered toward her, then away. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he squeezed his eyes shut, as if bracing himself. The shame was unmistakable. It sat on him heavier than the thin blanket, heavier than the illness itself. He had survived a war, built a career, raised a family. Being seen like this, helpless, exposed, was a humiliation he hadn't prepared for. Emily didn't comment on it. She didn't apologize for seeing. She simply acted. She guided him slowly toward the bathroom, supporting his weight with steady hands. He was frighteningly light, his body reduced to angles and sharp edges. Each step cost him effort, and when his knees threatened to give out, she adjusted without a word, compensating instinctively, the way she always did when someone was weaker than they wanted to admit. The bathroom was just as cold, but she turned on the shower and waited until steam began to rise. She tested the water with her wrist, adjusting until it was comfortably warm. Her movements were efficient but gentle, careful not to rush him, careful not to make the moment feel clinical or stripped of dignity. Victor kept his eyes averted as she helped him out of his soiled clothes. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling. Emily focused on the task, on the mechanics of care, letting that guide her. Warm water washed over his back, over skin that felt too thin, too fragile. She worked slowly, methodically, as if every motion mattered. "It's all right," she said softly when his shoulders tensed. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about." She didn't expect an answer. She didn't need one. Once he was clean and dry, she dressed him in thick, loose pajamas she found folded in a drawer. They hung on him awkwardly, far too large, but they were warm. She wrapped him in a clean blanket and guided him back to the recliner, positioning him carefully, making sure his head and legs were supported. The house was beginning to lose its edge. The cold was retreating inch by inch. Emily moved to the kitchen and opened a can of soup, heating it slowly on the stove. The quiet, bubbling sound felt almost intrusive in the silence. She poured it into a bowl, crumbled a few crackers on top, and carried it back. Victor watched her with tired eyes as she set the bowl on the table beside him. He hesitated before lifting the spoon, his hand shaking badly. Emily steadied the bowl without comment, allowing him the space to do what he could on his own. They ate in silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers, nor the strained quiet of resentment. It was something quieter than that. Shared. Intentional. By the time he finished, Victor leaned back, his eyes closing briefly as his breathing evened out. The worst of the shaking had subsided. Emily sat nearby, listening to the hum of the heater, watching the color slowly return to his face. Whatever came next, whatever explanations waited in this house, could wait. Right now, there was only this moment, and in it, they were no longer defined by titles or obligation. They were simply two people, bound by care, holding the line together. Once Victor had settled into a light, exhausted sleep, Emily stood and moved quietly back toward the kitchen. The house felt different now. Still heavy, still wrong, but no longer abandoned. The heater continued its steady work, and the sharp edge of the cold had softened. On the counter, near the charging dock, sat the family iPad. Emily hadn't noticed it earlier. Brady usually left it there, rarely bothering with passwords or privacy. She hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. This wasn't curiosity. It was instinct. Something in her knew there was more waiting beneath the surface of the note. The screen lit up immediately. A notification banner slid down from the top. Instagram. You were tagged in a photo. Emily frowned slightly and tapped the alert. The image filled the screen in a wash of bright color. Sunlight, turquoise water, an ocean so vivid it looked unreal. Brady stood at the center of the frame, relaxed and smiling in a way she hadn't seen in months. His arm was wrapped around the waist of a young woman wearing a bikini top and oversized sunglasses. She couldn't have been older than her early 20s. They were standing on the deck of a cruise ship. The caption sat just below the image, casual and careless, filled with emojis and hashtags about vacations and living their best life. Emily didn't read it twice. She didn't need to. Her grip tightened slightly on the edge of the tablet. She exited the app and opened the banking application instead. Navy Federal Credit Union. The joint account she and Brady had shared for years. The account where her paycheck went. The account she had trusted him to manage while she worked long hours and stayed on the road. The app loaded. For a moment, she thought there had been a mistake, that she was looking at the wrong screen. The balance displayed was impossibly low, barely more than $1,000. Emily blinked and refreshed the page. The number didn't change. Her pulse slowed instead of spiking, a strange calm settling over her as she opened the transaction history. The list scrolled past smoothly, each line item precise and undeniable. Cruise line charges, a drinks package, multiple ATM withdrawals at a casino, cash advances taken in rapid succession, amounts large enough to make her chest tighten. She recognized one transaction immediately. The roof fund. 3 months earlier, Brady had told her the flashing around the chimney was failing. He'd said the contractor needed a deposit. She had transferred the money without hesitation, trusting him to handle it while she focused on work. There had been no contractor. There had been no repair. That money had paid for ocean views, slot machines, and nights she hadn't been invited to share. Emily set the iPad down slowly on the counter. The realization didn't crash into her. It settled piece by piece, locking into place with brutal clarity. This wasn't just infidelity. It was theft. She had been more than betrayed. She had been used. Her labor, her savings, her sense of responsibility, all of it quietly drained to finance someone else's escape. Emily stood there for a long moment, staring at the reflection of her own face in the darkened screen. There were no tears, no shaking hands, only understanding. And once that settled, it did not leave room for doubt. Victor stirred in the recliner with a sharp intake of breath, his hand tightening against the armrest. The movement was small but urgent, the kind that signaled pain breaking through exhaustion. His face tightened, color draining as a low sound escaped his throat, more breath than voice. Emily was beside him instantly. "What is it?" she asked, already scanning him, reading the signs. His breathing had changed, shorter, faster. His body curled inward, instinctively protecting itself. "The pain," Victor managed, his voice thin and strained. His hand pressed against his abdomen, fingers digging in as if he could hold the sensation back by force. Emily nodded once. "Okay, I'm here." She reached for the small side table beside the recliner, where a cluster of orange prescription bottles stood lined up like silent witnesses. Her eyes moved quickly efficiently, until she found the one she was looking for. Morphine sulfate. Oral solution. She picked it up and checked the label. The dosage was clear, the instructions precise. This wasn't unfamiliar territory to her. She had reviewed enough compliance cases, enough medical documentation, to know exactly what this medication should look like and how it should behave. "When was your last dose?" she asked. "This morning," Victor said, his words broken by a hiss of breath. Before they left." Emily unscrewed the cap and drew the liquid into the dropper. She paused. The fluid inside was clear, completely clear. It moved too fast, too thinly, sliding through the dropper without resistance. Morphine solution had weight to it, a slight viscosity, a faint color, a chemical smell. This had none. Emily brought the dropper closer, her expression unreadable. She hesitated only a second before touching a single drop to her tongue. There was nothing. No bitterness. No medicinal edge. It was water. She lowered the dropper slowly, her hand steady despite the heat building behind her eyes. "Victor," she said, her voice quiet but precise. "Did Elaine change this?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched. Then he nodded once, the movement barely visible. She said, "The pharmacy raised the price," he whispered. "Said we had to stretch it. Said it was too expensive." Emily set the bottle down with care, as if sudden movement might shatter something irreversible. The room felt impossibly still. "She replaced it," Emily said, more to herself than to him. "She replaced your pain medication with water." Victor swallowed hard. "She needed the money," he said, a bitter edge slipping into his voice despite the pain. "For the cruise. For a new bag. Said I didn't need the full dose anyway." Something inside Emily shifted completely. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't ignorance or carelessness or cruelty born of inconvenience. This was a decision, a calculated act. Pain deliberately allowed. Suffering intentionally prolonged. Elder abuse. Medical tampering. Crimes with names, statutes, consequences. Emily straightened, her expression no longer marked by shock or confusion. What rose in its place was colder, steadier, moral certainty, the kind that didn't waver once it arrived. "You didn't deserve this," she said quietly, meeting Victor's eyes. "Not for a second." She reached for another blanket and adjusted it around him. Her movements gentle but purposeful. Her voice remained calm, controlled, but the line had been crossed, and she knew it with absolute clarity. Whatever came next was no longer a matter of emotion. It was a matter of record. Victor's breathing gradually steadied, though the pain still lingered in the tight lines of his face. Emily remained close, watching him, giving him time. The heater hummed softly in the background, filling the room with a low, constant sound that made the silence feel less absolute. After a moment, Victor spoke again. "They think they took everything," he said quietly. Emily looked up. "Who?" "Elaine. Brady." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "They think what's gone from the checking account is all there ever was." Emily didn't interrupt him. She could hear the shift in his voice now. The weakness was still there, but something firmer had taken hold beneath it. "I worked in banking for more than 30 years, Victor continued. "I didn't survive that long by trusting the wrong people with the main vault." He paused, gathering his breath. The account they drained was never the real one. Emily's eyes stayed on him, steady, attentive. "There's a trust," Victor said. "A revocable living trust. I set it up years ago before Elaine. Before all of this." He swallowed. "It's held separately, managed properly. Stocks, bonds, proceeds from the house I sold in Virginia." Emily felt the weight of the words before he finished. "It's worth just over $3 million, he said. 3.2. Last time I checked." The room didn't change, but the balance of power inside it did. Elaine's complaints about money, Brady's careless spending, the way they had treated Victor, like a burden, suddenly rearranged themselves into something coherent. They hadn't stayed because they loved him. They had stayed because they believed there was a payout waiting. They never knew. Emily asked. Victor shook his head, slowly. I let them see what I wanted them to see. Small deposits. Just enough to keep them interested. His gaze hardened. I wanted to know who would stay when there was nothing to gain. The answer had arrived on a cruise ship. I don't have much time, Victor said after a pause. But I have enough. He looked directly at Emily now, his expression clear, deliberate. I want to amend the trust. And the will. Emily nodded once. I'll call an attorney. I already have one, Victor replied. She's local. She knows everything. I want you named executor. He hesitated briefly, then continued. And beneficiary. Emily's breath caught, not in surprise, but in the gravity of what he was placing in her hands. Half of it should go to charity, Victor said. Veterans. People who didn't abandon their own. His voice was calm, resolute. The rest goes to you. There was no anger in his tone. No bitterness. Just decision. Emily didn't argue. She didn't protest or deflect. She understood what he was doing. And why. This wasn't generosity born of impulse. It was correction. I'll make sure it's done properly, she said. Every step. Every signature. Victor nodded, satisfied. I know you will. For the first time since she had arrived, Emily felt the situation fully stabilize. Not because the pain was gone, or because the loss ahead was any less real, but because the truth was finally anchored. Elaine and Brady had believed they were clever. They had believed neglect would go unnoticed. That cruelty could be disguised as inconvenience. They were wrong. Victor closed his eyes, exhaustion settling back over him. But the resolve remained. The trust existed. The decision had been made. And the ground beneath the people who had abandoned him was already beginning to shift. Emily waited until Victor had drifted into another shallow sleep before she stood. The house was warmer now, but the damage had already been done. Warmth could not erase hours of exposure, nor could it soften what had been deliberately allowed to happen. She took out her phone. There was no hesitation in her movements, no shaking hands. She approached the room the way she approached an audit, methodically, aware that what mattered most was accuracy. She began with the living room. She photographed Victor exactly as he had been found. The thin blanket, the recliner angled toward the window, the floor beneath it. She captured the thermostat on the wall, the display showing how low the temperature had dropped. She photographed the empty water glass, the absence of food, the stillness of a space that had been left unattended. Each image was clear, time-stamped, unembellished. Then she moved closer. She documented Victor's condition with restraint and care. His cracked lips, the tremor in his hands, the way his body curved inward as if trying to conserve heat. She did not linger longer than necessary. This was not spectacle. This was record. Once she finished, she stepped outside. The snow had slowed, settling into a thin, quiet layer across the street. The neighboring houses glowed softly with interior lights. Emily crossed the short distance to the house next door and knocked. An older woman answered after a moment, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition. She had seen Emily's car arrive. Emily explained calmly that she was trying to establish a timeline for Victor's doctors. She asked simple questions. When had Brady left? Who had been with him? Whether anyone had come to check on Victor afterward. The answers came easily. The neighbor confirmed seeing Brady load suitcases days earlier. She mentioned a young woman with him. She confirmed that the house had been dark since then, that no nurse, no caregiver, no family member had arrived in the meantime. Emily thanked her and returned home, her phone recording quietly the entire time. Back inside, she sat at the kitchen counter and opened her messages. She typed carefully. Brady. It's urgent. Victor is in bad shape. He's asking for you and your mother. You need to come home now. The message sent. Delivered. Emily waited. The 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. The reply came quickly. You're overreacting. He's had bad days before. Mom says he's just looking for attention. We can't leave. The tickets are non-refundable. Just handle it. Emily read the message once. Then she took a screenshot. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened FaceTime and selected Elaine's contact. Before the call connected, she activated screen recording. A small red indicator appeared at the top of the screen. The call went through. The image that appeared was chaotic and bright. Loud music, neon lights, faces flushed from alcohol. Elaine and Brady were seated at a table crowded with drinks. Brady's arm rested casually around the same young woman Emily had seen in the photo. Emily kept her voice level as she explained the situation again. She angled the camera just enough for Victor to be visible in the background. His breathing labored. His body still. Elaine waved a dismissive hand. Brady leaned closer to the screen, irritation clear in his expression. They talked over Emily, over each other, over the gravity of what was happening. Elaine complained about the cost of flights. Brady told Emily to stop being dramatic. Someone laughed. The word non-refundable surfaced more than once. Emily said nothing more than necessary. When the call ended, she stopped the recording and saved the file. She sat there for a moment, the phone resting flat against the counter, the evidence secured. Photos, audio, video, messages, witness statements. There would be no room for interpretation, no space for denial. This was no longer a story shaped by emotion or memory. It was a complete record. And once something like that existed, it could not be undone. The attorney arrived quietly, just after night had fully settled over the neighborhood. She moved through the house with practiced composure, her expression tightening only briefly when she saw Victor's condition. There were no unnecessary words. Time was not a resource anyone pretended to have. The documents were laid out on the coffee table, clean and orderly. The amended trust, the revised will, everything prepared exactly as Victor had instructed. He was fully conscious when the pen was placed in his hand. Victor listened as the attorney explained each page, each clause. He nodded when appropriate, his eyes clear despite the pain that never fully left him. There was no confusion, no hesitation. When he signed, his hand shook. But the intention behind the motion was unmistakable. This was not impulse. It was closure. Emily stood nearby, silent, present. She did not rush him. She did not look away. When the last signature was finished, the attorney gathered the papers, confirming that everything would be filed immediately. She offered a brief, respectful nod to Victor before leaving, her footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. After that, there was nothing left to arrange. Emily stayed with him through the night. She sat beside the recliner, adjusting blankets when needed, offering water in small amounts, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as it shifted and slowed. Outside, the snow deepened, softening the world beyond the windows. Inside, the house felt still, held in suspension. Sometime after midnight, Victor stirred and opened his eyes. "Emily," he said softly. She leaned closer. "I'm here." "I've been thinking," he continued, his voice thin but steady, "about home." He paused. "Peaches." She understood immediately. Emily went to the kitchen and searched the pantry until she found a single can of sliced peaches. She warmed them slowly on the stove, adding nothing else. When they were ready, she brought them back in a small bowl, the steam rising gently into the room. Victor managed a faint smile as she offered him a spoonful. He didn't chew much. He didn't need to. He simply let the warmth and sweetness linger, his eyes closing briefly in something that looked like relief. After a few bites, he lifted one hand weakly and gestured toward his other. "The ring," he said. Emily gently slid the marine signet ring from his finger. The gold was worn smooth with age. The engraving softened but unmistakable. Victor wrapped his fingers around her hand, pressing the ring into her palm. "You're my family," he said. "You stayed." Emily closed her fingers around the ring and nodded, unable to trust her voice. Victor settled back, exhaustion finally overtaking him. His breathing grew slower, more irregular. Emily remained exactly where she was, holding his hand, counting the spaces between breaths, without panic, without fear. Just before dawn, the pauses grew longer. Then, quietly, without struggle, Victor took one last breath and did not take another. Emily waited. She listened. She counted. When she was certain, she reached out and closed his eyes, her touch gentle, deliberate. There was grief, deep and real, but it did not demand noise. Victor had not been abandoned at the end. He had been seen, and that was enough. Emily did not rush the morning. By the time the sun rose, the house had been returned to order. Not warmth or comfort, but clarity. She moved through each room with deliberate calm, placing things where they needed to be, removing anything that blurred the message. This was not staging. It was preparation. The dining table was moved to the center of the living room. On it, she laid out the evidence in clean, unmistakable lines. Printed bank statements with highlighted transactions, screenshots of messages, a tablet set to the correct file, volume adjusted. At the center of the table, resting on a dark cloth, was the urn containing Victor's ashes. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was dramatized. Emily changed into clean clothes and slipped Victor's marine signet ring onto her finger. It felt heavier than before, grounding rather than ornamental. When the house was ready, she sat down and waited. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway came just after mid-morning. Voices followed. Laughter. Complaints about the cold. The front door opened without hesitation, as if nothing had changed. Brady entered first, distracted, already speaking before he looked up. Elaine followed close behind, still irritated, still in motion. They expected questions. They expected explanations. They expected the inconvenience of being briefly interrupted and then forgiven. They did not expect silence. Emily stood. "Victor is gone," she said evenly. The words landed without force, without embellishment. Elaine frowned, processing only part of what she had heard. "Gone where?" she demanded. Emily stepped aside and gestured to the table. "He passed early this morning. He was cremated. That's him." The urn sat between the papers, immovable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elaine reacted the way Emily had expected. Too loudly, too suddenly, her grief rising in performance rather than shock. Brady followed. Confusion giving way to anger. Accusations forming quickly and without logic. Words overlapped. Blame shifted. Emily did not respond. She reached for the tablet and pressed play. Victor's recorded testimony filled the room. His voice, weakened but unmistakably clear, stated his name, the date, his awareness. He spoke of the cold, the abandoned house, the medication replaced with water. He spoke of calling them, of being dismissed, of hearing the words non-refundable. Elaine went still. Brady's face drained of color. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. That was when the attorney stepped forward. She introduced herself calmly and opened the file she carried. She read from the amended will, her voice precise, her tone professional. The trust, the amount, the beneficiaries. Elaine and Brady received nothing. The words were not softened. They were not negotiable. The attorney continued, outlining the legal findings already in motion. The documented evidence, the medication tampering, the classification of elder abuse, the referrals made, the investigations pending. Elaine's outrage collapsed into panic. Brady's anger dissolved into fear. Emily listened without expression. When the reading was finished, she spoke again. "You no longer have any claim to this house. You will leave today." Elaine protested. Brady argued. Neither was acknowledged. The attorney confirmed the timeline and the authority. The decision stood. Emily opened the front door and waited. Eventually they left. Not with dignity, not with apologies, just with what they could carry and the understanding that nothing they said would matter now. When the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not empty, finished. Emily picked up the urn and held it briefly, then set it back down. She slipped on her coat, reached for her keys, and paused once at the threshold. The house no longer belonged to grief or betrayal. It belonged to truth. Outside, the air was cold and clean. Emily walked down the steps, Victor's ring catching the light as she moved. She did not look back. The work was done. And for the first time since she had begun the drive home days earlier, Emily felt free.